Chapter 1. The Invitation. The rain fell in a steady drizzle over London, the cobblestone streets glistening under the dim glow of gas lamps. Jane Parsons sat in her modest office above a tailor's shop on Baker Street, her feet propped up on her desk as she sipped a cup of strong tea. The room was cluttered with case files, newspaper clippings, and the occasional oddity from past investigations, a magnifying glass here, a locked box there. Jane's sharp eyes scanned the latest edition of the Times, though her mind wandered to the lack of interesting cases lately. The elite of British society had been unusually quiet, and Jane missed the thrill of unravelling their secrets. The sound of the door creaking open pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant, a young man named Thomas, poked his head in, his spectacles slightly askew. "Miss Parsons, you've got a visitor. A Mr. Harold Whitcomb says it's urgent." Jane raised an eyebrow. Whitcomb? That name sounds familiar. "He's the personal secretary to Lord Ashworth," Thomas explained, stepping aside to allow the visitor to enter. Mr. Whitcomb was a tall, wiry man with a nervous demeanour. His tailored suit was damp from the rain, and he clutched a leather briefcase tightly to his chest. "Miss Parsons," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I apologise for the intrusion, but my employer, Lord Ashworth, requires your services immediately." Jane gestured for him to take a seat. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Whitcomb?" The man hesitated, glancing around the room. "It's a rather delicate matter," he said, lowering his voice. "Lord Ashworth is hosting a weekend gathering at his estate in Hampshire. A number of prominent individuals will be in attendance. However, there have been concerning developments. My employer believes a crime may be imminent, and he wishes for you to attend the event discreetly to ensure nothing untoward occurs." Jane leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of crime are we talking about?" Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably. "Lord Ashworth has recently come into possession of a highly sensitive document, the deed to his family estate. It's a matter of great importance, not only to him, but to the future of the Ashworth lineage. He fears that someone among the guests may attempt to steal it." Jane raised an eyebrow. "And why would someone want to steal a property deed?" Whitcomb's face flushed. "The estate is one of the most valuable in England, Miss Parsons. Its ownership has been contested in the past. Lord Ashworth believes there are those who would go to great lengths to seize control of it." Jane considered this for a moment. "Why me? Surely Lord Ashworth has his own security measures in place." "He does," Whitcomb admitted, "but he requires someone with your particular skills, someone who can blend in, observe, and act without drawing attention. Your reputation precedes you, Miss Parsons." Jane smirked. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Whitcomb. Very well, I'll attend, but I'll need full access to the estate and its guests." Whitcomb nodded eagerly. "Of course. You'll be introduced as a distant cousin of Lady Ashworth. No one will suspect a thing." 2 days later, Jane found herself standing on the grand steps of Ashworth Manor, a sprawling estate nestled in the rolling hills of Hampshire. The manor was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, its ivy-covered walls and towering windows exuding an air of timeless elegance. Jane adjusted her hat, ensuring it sat at just the right angle, and smoothed the fabric of her emerald green evening gown. She had chosen the outfit carefully, stylish enough to blend in with the elite, yet practical enough to allow for quick movement if necessary. The butler, a stoic man with a face like granite, greeted her at the door. "Miss Parsons, welcome to Ashworth Manor. Lord and Lady Ashworth are expecting you." Jane followed him through the opulent foyer, her eyes taking in every detail. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. The butler led her to the drawing-room, where a small group of guests had gathered for pre-dinner drinks. Lord Ashworth, a tall man with a commanding presence and a neatly trimmed moustache, approached her immediately. "Miss Parsons," he said, his voice low, "thank you for coming. I trust Mr. Whitcomb explained the situation?" Jane nodded. "He did. I'll need to familiarise myself with the layout of the house and the guests." Lord Ashworth glanced around the room before continuing. "The deed is kept in the safe in my study. Only my wife and I know the combination. However, given the nature of our guests, I fear it may not be enough." Jane followed his gaze to the other guests. There was Sir Reginald Blythe, a retired judge with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless; Miss Evelyn Hart, a young artist whose bohemian style stood out among the aristocracy; Mr. Charles Whittaker, a wealthy industrialist with a penchant for shady deals; and Mrs. Beatrice Crowe, a gossip columnist who seemed to know everyone's secrets. "I'll keep an eye on them," Jane assured him, "but I'll need to move freely." Lord Ashworth nodded. "Of course. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must attend to my other guests." Jane mingled with the group, her sharp eyes noting every detail. Miss Evelyn Hart seemed unusually nervous, her hands trembling as she sipped her champagne. Sir Reginald Blythe was engaged in a heated discussion with Mr. Whittaker, their voices low and tense. Mrs. Crowe, meanwhile, was scribbling furiously in a small notebook, her eyes darting around the room. As the evening progressed, Jane felt a growing sense of unease. The tension in the room was palpable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Her suspicions were confirmed later that night, when a scream echoed through the halls. Jane rushed to the source of the commotion, Lord Ashworth's study. The door was ajar, and inside, Lady Ashworth stood clutching a handkerchief to her mouth, her face pale with shock. "It's gone," she whispered, pointing to the open safe. "The deed. It's gone." Jane stepped forward, her mind already racing. The game was afoot. Chapter 2. The Cast of Suspects. The study was in disarray. Papers were scattered across the desk, and the safe door hung open, its contents conspicuously absent. Lady Ashworth stood frozen in the doorway, her hands still pressed to her mouth, while Lord Ashworth paced the room, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Jane Parsons moved quickly, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She knelt beside the safe, noting the faint smudge of ink on the dial, evidence that someone had tampered with it. The room was otherwise undisturbed, suggesting the thief had known exactly what they were looking for. "When was the last time you saw the deed?" Jane asked, turning to Lord Ashworth. "This afternoon," he replied, his voice tight. "I placed it in the safe myself. The combination is known only to my wife and me." Jane glanced at Lady Ashworth, who nodded in confirmation. "I haven't touched the safe since this morning," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear it." Jane's gaze shifted to the other guests, who had begun to gather in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Sir Reginald Blythe stood at the front of the group, his expression unreadable. Miss Evelyn Hart hovered nervously behind him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. Charles Whittaker leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, while Mrs. Beatrice Crowe peered over his shoulder, her notebook already in hand. "What's happened?" Sir Reginald demanded, his voice sharp. "The deed to the estate has been stolen," Lord Ashworth replied. A murmur of shock rippled through the group. Jane watched their reactions carefully, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. Sir Reginald's jaw tightened, while Miss Evelyn's eyes darted nervously around the room. Mr. Whittaker's lips curled into a faint smirk, and Mrs. Crowe began scribbling furiously in her notebook. "This is outrageous," Sir Reginald declared. "Who would dare commit such a brazen act?" "That's what I intend to find out," Jane said, stepping forward. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually. Please return to the drawing room and wait for me there." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but complied, filing out of the study. Once they were gone, she turned back to Lord and Lady Ashworth. "I'll need a list of everyone who had access to this room today," she said, "and any information you can provide about your guests. No detail is too small." Lord Ashworth nodded. "Of course, I'll have Mr. Whitcomb assist you." Jane began her investigation in the drawing room, where the guests had gathered in tense silence. She started with Sir Reginald Blythe, who sat in a high-backed chair by the fireplace, his posture rigid and his expression stern. "Sir Reginald," Jane began, taking a seat across from him, "can you tell me where you were this evening?" The retired judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you interrogating me, Miss Parsons?" "I'm simply gathering information," Jane replied smoothly. "It's standard procedure in cases like this." Sir Reginald sighed. "Very well, I was in the library for most of the evening reading. I returned to my room shortly before the commotion." "Did you see or hear anything unusual?" "No," Sir Reginald said, his tone clipped. "But if I may offer some advice, Miss Parsons, you would do well to focus your attention on Mr. Whittaker. He's always been a slippery character." Jane made a note of this, but said nothing. She moved on to Miss Evelyn Hart, who sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Miss Hart," Jane said, her tone gentle, "can you tell me about your evening?" Evelyn nodded, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was in the garden for most of the evening. I needed some air." Jane noted the faint tremor in her voice. "Did you see anyone else in the garden?" Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I was alone." Jane studied her for a moment before moving on to Mr. Charles Whittaker, who lounged in an armchair with an air of casual indifference. "Mr. Whittaker," Jane began, "where were you this evening?" Whittaker smirked. "Here and there, Miss Parsons. I had a drink in the drawing-room, took a stroll through the gallery, and then retired to my room." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Whittaker shrugged. "Not really, though I did see Sir Reginald lurking near the study earlier. Seemed a bit odd, if you ask me." Jane made a mental note of this before turning to Mrs. Beatrice Crowe, who sat at the writing desk, her notebook open in front of her. "Mrs. Crowe," Jane said, "can you tell me about your evening?" The gossip columnist looked up, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Of course, dear. I was in the drawing-room for most of the evening, observing the guests. You'd be surprised what people reveal when they think no one is watching." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Mrs. Crowe tapped her pen against her chin. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see Miss Evelyn slip out of the house around dusk. She seemed rather nervous." Jane thanked her and made her way to the final guest, Mr. Harold Whitcomb, Lord Ashworth's secretary. He stood in the corner of the room, his face pale, and his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Mr. Whitcomb," Jane said, "can you tell me about your evening?" Whitcomb nodded eagerly. "Of course, Miss Parsons. I was in the study for most of the evening, organising Lord Ashworth's papers. I left shortly before the theft was discovered." "Did you see or hear anything unusual?" Whitcomb hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing out of the ordinary." Jane studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Whitcomb. That will be all for now." As Jane left the drawing-room, she thought of all the possibilities. Each guest had provided an alibi, but none of them were entirely convincing. Sir Reginald's disdain for Mr. Whittaker suggested a personal grudge, while Miss Evelyn's nervousness hinted at a hidden secret. Mr. Whittaker's casual demeanour was suspicious, and Mrs. Crowe's eagerness to share information made Jane wonder what she was hiding. Even Mr. Whitcomb's eagerness to assist seemed a little too convenient. Jane made her way to the study, where Lord and Lady Ashworth were waiting. "Well," Lord Ashworth demanded, "what have you learned?" "It's too early to say," Jane replied. "But I have a few leads. I'll need to conduct a more thorough investigation of the study and the surrounding areas." Lord Ashworth nodded. "Do whatever you need to do, Miss Parsons. Just find that deed." Jane spent the next hour examining the study, searching for any clues the thief might have left behind. She found a faint footprint near the window, suggesting someone had entered or exited through it. She also discovered a small scrap of paper tucked under the desk, its edges charred as if it had been partially burned. As she examined the scrap, Jane's eyes narrowed. It was a fragment of a letter, the handwriting familiar. She tucked it into her pocket for further perusal. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. Mystery. The rain had begun to fall again, tapping softly against the windows of Ashworth Manor as Jane Parsons sat in the study, thinking. The faint footprint near the window and the charred scrap of paper were the only tangible clues she had so far. She stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkened grounds. The thief had likely entered or exited through this window, but how? The study was on the second floor, and the drop to the ground below was significant. She opened the window and leaned out, her eyes scanning the ivy-covered wall. The thick vines appeared undisturbed, but Jane noticed a few broken tendrils near the base of the window. Someone had climbed up or down recently. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. She turned her attention back to the room, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. The safe door still hung open, its contents gone. Jane knelt in front of it, examining the dial. The faint smudge of ink she had noticed earlier was still there, and she now saw a small scratch near the combination numbers. Someone had tried to force the safe open, but had ultimately used the correct combination. Jane's thoughts turned to Lord and Lady Ashworth. They claimed to be the only ones who knew the combination, but was that truly the case? She made a note to question them further, but first she needed to gather more evidence. Jane decided to revisit the guests' alibis, starting with Sir Reginald Blythe. She found him in the library, seated in a high-backed chair with a book in hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Miss Parsons," he said, closing the book with a snap, "have you solved the mystery yet?" "Not yet," Jane replied, taking a seat across from him, "but I have a few questions if you don't mind." Sir Reginald sighed. "Very well. What do you want to know?" "You mentioned earlier that you were in the library this evening. Can anyone confirm that?" The retired judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I'm lying?" "Not at all," Jane said smoothly. "I'm simply trying to establish a timeline." Sir Reginald leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose the butler saw me when he brought me a brandy. Other than that, I was alone." Jane nodded, making a note in her small notebook. "And you said you saw Mr. Whittaker near the study earlier. Can you tell me more about that?" Sir Reginald's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Whittaker has always been a slippery character. I wouldn't put it past him to try something like this." "Do you have any proof of that?" "Proof?" Sir Reginald scoffed. "No, but I've known the man for years. He's always been more interested in money than principles." Jane thanked him and left the library. Sir Reginald's disdain for Mr. Whittaker was evident, but was it enough to implicate him in the theft? Next, she sought out Miss Evelyn Hart, who was sitting in the conservatory, her sketch-pad in hand. The young artist looked up as Jane approached, her expression nervous. "Miss Hart," Jane began, taking a seat beside her, "I need to ask you a few more questions about this evening." Evelyn nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Of course." "You mentioned earlier that you were in the garden. Can anyone confirm that?" Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I was alone. I needed some time to think." Jane studied her for a moment, noting the faint shadows under her eyes. "Is everything all right, Miss Hart? You seem troubled." Evelyn looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing, just family matters." Jane decided not to press further, but she made a mental note to keep an eye on the young artist. There was clearly more to her story. Her next target was Mr. Charles Whittaker. Jane found Mr. Whittaker in the billiards room, leaning over the table as he lined up a shot. He looked up as she entered, his smirk widening. "Miss Parsons," he said, straightening, "come to interrogate me again?" "Just a few more questions," Jane replied, her tone neutral. "You mentioned earlier that you saw Sir Reginald near the study. Can you tell me more about that?" Whittaker chuckled, leaning on his cue. "Old Reginald's always lurking about, isn't he? I wouldn't be surprised if he's behind this whole thing." "Do you have any proof of that?" Whittaker shrugged. "Proof? Number? But the man's got a grudge against Lord Ashworth. Everyone knows it." Jane nodded, making a note in her notebook. "And where were you this evening, Mr. Whittaker?" "I told you before," he said, his tone growing impatient. "I was in the drawing room, then the gallery, then my room. Can anyone confirm that?" Whittaker's smirk faded, replaced by a look of annoyance. "The butler saw me in the drawing room. Other than that, no." Jane thanked him and left the billiards room, her mind racing. Whittaker's alibi was shaky at best, and his animosity towards Sir Reginald was suspicious. Next was Mrs. Beatrice Crowe, the gossip columnist. Jane found Mrs. Crowe in the drawing room, her notebook open in front of her as she scribbled furiously. She looked up as Jane approached, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Miss Parsons," she said, setting down her pen, "have you solved the mystery yet?" "Not yet," Jane replied, "but I have a few more questions if you don't mind." Mrs. Crowe leaned forward, her expression eager. "Of course, dear. What do you want to know?" "You mentioned earlier that you saw Miss Evelyn slip out of the house around dusk. Can you tell me more about that?" Mrs. Crowe nodded, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She looked nervous, dear, very nervous. I wouldn't be surprised if she's involved in this whole affair." Jane made a note of this, but said nothing. "And where were you this evening, Mrs. Crowe?" The gossip columnist waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, here and there. I was in the drawing room for most of the evening, observing the guests. You'd be surprised what people reveal when they think no one is watching." Jane thanked her and left the drawing room, her mind turning over the information she had gathered. Each guest had provided an alibi, but none of them were entirely convincing. Back in her room, Jane carefully unfolded the charred scrap of paper she had found in the study. The handwriting was familiar, and as she examined it more closely, she realised it matched the elegant script of Lady Ashworth. The fragment read, "Must act quickly. The deed is the key to everything. If we don't—" Jane's eyes narrowed. What was Lady Ashworth planning? And why had this note been burned? She tucked the scrap back into her pocket and made her way to Lord Ashworth's study. Chapter 4. The Secret Rendezvous. The rain had stopped by the time Jane Parsons left Lord Ashworth's study, but the air was still heavy with tension. The charred scrap of paper weighed heavily in her pocket, its message gnawing at her thoughts. Lady Ashworth's handwriting was unmistakable, and the words, "The deed is the key to everything," suggested a deeper layer to the mystery. Jane needed to confront Lady Ashworth, but she knew she had to tread carefully. As she made her way to the drawing room, she overheard a heated conversation coming from the conservatory. The voices were low, but unmistakably tense. Jane paused and quietly moved closer to the source of the argument. Peering through the partially open door, she saw Sir Reginald Blythe and Mr. Charles Whittaker standing face to face, their expressions dark. "You've gone too far this time, Whittaker," Sir Reginald hissed, his voice trembling with anger. Do you think I don't know what you're up to?" Whittaker smirked, though his eyes were cold. "And what exactly am I up to, Reginald? Enlighten me." "You've been sniffing around the Ashworth estate for years," Sir Reginald shot back. "But stealing the deed, that's a new low, even for you." Whittaker's smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. "You think I stole the deed? That's rich coming from you. Everyone knows you've been trying to get your hands on this estate for decades." Sir Reginald's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Jane stepped into the room, her presence cutting through the tension like a knife. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone calm but firm, "is there something I should know?" Both men turned to her, their expressions shifting from anger to unease. Sir Reginald was the first to recover. "Miss Parsons," he said, his voice tight, "this is a private matter." "I'm afraid nothing is private in a case like this," Jane replied, her gaze shifting between the two men. "If you have information that could help me recover the deed, I suggest you share it now." Whittaker crossed his arms, his smirk returning. "I was just telling Sir Reginald here that he's the one with a motive. He's been after this estate for years." Sir Reginald's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Jane held up a hand. "Enough. I'll decide who has a motive and who doesn't. For now, I suggest you both return to your rooms and refrain from further discussions." The two men glared at each other but complied, leaving the conservatory in tense silence. Jane watched them go. The animosity between them was palpable, but was it enough to implicate either of them in the theft? Jane's next stop was Miss Evelyn Hart's room. The young artist had been evasive earlier, and Jane was determined to uncover the truth. She knocked softly on the door, and after a moment, Evelyn opened it, her eyes red and puffy as if she had been crying. "Miss Parsons," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what can I do for you?" "I need to ask you a few more questions," Jane replied, her tone gentle. "May I come in?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let Jane enter. The room was small but cosy, with an easel set up near the window and several half-finished paintings leaning against the walls. Jane's eyes were drawn to one in particular, a portrait of a man who bore a striking resemblance to Lord Ashworth. "Is this your work?" Jane asked, gesturing to the painting. Evelyn nodded, her expression uneasy. "Yes, I've been working on it for a while." Jane studied the painting for a moment before turning back to Evelyn. "Miss Hart, I need you to be honest with me. Why were you in the garden this evening?" Evelyn's hands trembled as she clasped them in front of her. I needed some air. The party was overwhelming." Jane's gaze softened. "I understand, but I need to know if there's more to it than that. Did you see anything unusual? Or anyone?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. I saw someone climbing the ivy near the study window. It was too dark to see who it was, but they moved quickly." Jane's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" Evelyn looked away, her voice barely audible. "I was scared. I didn't want to get involved." Jane placed a hand on her shoulder, her tone reassuring. "You're not in trouble, Miss Hart, but if you know anything else, now is the time to tell me." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "There's something else. Earlier today I overheard Lady Ashworth arguing with someone in the study. She sounded desperate." Jane's mind raced. Lady Ashworth's involvement was becoming increasingly clear, but what was her role in all of this? Back in her room, Jane carefully unfolded the charred scrap of paper and examined it again. The words, "The deed is the key to everything," echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Ashworth was at the centre of the mystery. She decided to confront Lady Ashworth directly. Finding her in the drawing-room, Jane approached her with a polite smile. "Lady Ashworth," she began, her tone neutral, "I need to ask you a few questions about the theft." Lady Ashworth looked up, her expression guarded. "Of course, Miss Parsons. What do you need to know?" Jane held up the scrap of paper. "I found this in the study. It appears to be in your handwriting." Lady Ashworth's face paled, but she quickly recovered. "Where did you find that?" "In the study," Jane repeated, "near the safe. Can you explain what it means?" Lady Ashworth hesitated, then sighed. "Very well. I suppose there's no point in hiding it any longer. The deed, it's not just a piece of paper. It's the key to a secret that could destroy this family." Jane's eyes narrowed. "What kind of secret?" Lady Ashworth looked away, her voice trembling. "The estate. It doesn't belong to us. Not really. My husband's grandfather acquired it through less than honourable means. If the truth were to come out, it would ruin us." Jane studied her for a moment, her mind racing. "And you think someone stole the deed to expose this secret?" Lady Ashworth nodded. "Yes, but I don't know who. That's why I asked you to come, Miss Parsons. I need your help to find the deed before it's too late." Jane nodded, her expression determined. "I'll do everything I can, but I need you to be honest with me from now on. No more secrets." Lady Ashworth nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Parsons. I'll do whatever it takes." As Jane left the drawing-room, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The mystery was deeper than she had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 5. The Courtroom. Drama. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Ashworth Manor, casting long shadows. The atmosphere was tense as the guests gathered for what Sir Reginald Blythe had insisted on calling a mock trial. Jane stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed and her expression thoughtful. She had agreed to the trial reluctantly, seeing it as an opportunity to observe the guests' reactions and perhaps uncover new clues. Lord and Lady Ashworth sat at the head of the room, their faces pale and drawn. Sir Reginald, ever the retired judge, had taken it upon himself to preside over the proceedings. He sat at a makeshift judge's bench, his expression stern and his gavel, a silver paperweight, ready at hand. "This is highly irregular," Lord Ashworth muttered, his voice low but audible. "Desperate times call for desperate measures," Sir Reginald replied, his tone clipped. "Now, if everyone will take their seats, we can begin." The guests reluctantly complied, seating themselves in a semicircle around the room. Jane took a seat near the back, her notebook in hand, and her sharp eyes scanning the group. The trial begins. Sir Reginald cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to uncover the truth about the theft of the Ashworth estate deed. Each of you will have the opportunity to speak, and I expect nothing but honesty." He turned to Lord Ashworth first. "Lord Ashworth, as the owner of the deed, can you provide any insight into its disappearance?" Lord Ashworth shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "As I've said before, the deed was in the safe in my study. Only my wife and I know the combination. I have no idea how it was stolen." Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed. "And yet it was. Miss Parsons, would you care to share your findings?" Jane stood, her calm demeanour a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "I've examined the scene of the crime and spoken with each of you. There are a few key points to consider. First, the safe was opened with the correct combination, suggesting the thief had inside knowledge. Second, there was a faint ink smudge on the dial, which may indicate that someone used a pen to mark the numbers. Finally, a scrap of paper was found near the safe, partially burned and bearing Lady Ashworth's handwriting. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, and Lady Ashworth's face paled. What are you implying, Miss Parsons? Jane met her gaze evenly. I'm not implying anything, Lady Ashworth. I'm simply presenting the facts. Sir Reginald turned to Lady Ashworth next. Lady Ashworth, can you explain this scrap of paper? Lady Ashworth hesitated, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. I don't know what it is. I certainly didn't burn anything. Jane raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She had already confronted Lady Ashworth about the scrap of paper and knew there was more to the story, but she wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. The guests' testimonies. Sir Reginald called each guest to the stand, starting with Mr. Charles Whittaker. The industrialist lounged in his chair, his smirk firmly in place as he answered Sir Reginald's questions. Mr. Whittaker, Sir Reginald began, his tone sharp, where were you at the time of the theft? Whittaker shrugged. As I've said before, I was in the drawing-room, then the gallery, then my room. The butler can confirm I was in the drawing-room. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed. And what is your relationship with Lord Ashworth? Whittaker's smirk faded slightly. We've had our differences, but that's no secret. I've never stolen from him if that's what you're implying. Sir Reginald turned to Miss Evelyn Hart next. The young artist looked nervous as she took the stand, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Hart, Sir Reginald said, his tone slightly gentler, can you tell us about your evening? Evelyn nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I was in the garden for most of the evening. I needed some air. Did you see anything unusual? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. I saw someone climbing the ivy near the study window. It was too dark to see who it was. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Finally, Sir Reginald called Mrs. Beatrice Crowe to the stand. The gossip columnist looked eager as she took her seat, her notebook already in hand. Mrs. Crowe, Sir Reginald began, his tone wary, can you tell us about your evening? Mrs. Crowe nodded, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I was in the drawing-room for most of the evening, observing the guests. I did see Miss Evelyn slip out of the house around dusk. She seemed rather nervous. Evelyn's face flushed, but she said nothing. As the trial progressed, Jane noticed a pattern. Each guest had a motive, but none of them had a solid alibi. Sir Reginald's animosity toward Whittaker, Evelyn's nervousness, Mrs. Crowe's eagerness to share information, it all pointed to a deeper layer of intrigue. Finally, Jane stood and addressed the room. There's one more thing I'd like to share. Earlier today, I found a letter in Lady Ashworth's desk addressed to Sir Reginald. It suggests that he has been investigating the Ashworth estate's history. Sir Reginald's face flushed with anger. That letter is private. Not any more, Jane replied, her tone calm but firm. The contents of the letter suggest that the Ashworth estate was acquired under questionable circumstances. If the truth were to come out, it could ruin the family. A stunned silence fell over the room. Lady Ashworth looked away, her face pale, while Lord Ashworth's expression darkened. Is this true? Lord Ashworth demanded, turning to his wife. Lady Ashworth hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I was trying to protect us. Sir Reginald slammed his gavel down, his voice sharp. This trial is adjourned. Miss Parsons, I suggest you continue your investigation, discreetly. As the guests dispersed, Jane remained in the grand hall, her mind racing. The trial had revealed new layers of the mystery, but it had also raised more questions. Chapter 6. The Hidden Motive. The grand hall of Ashworth Manor was eerily quiet after the mock trial. Jane Parsons stood by the fireplace, her notebook in hand, reviewing the testimonies and the new revelations. The letter she had found in Lady Ashworth's desk had shifted the entire investigation, exposing a web of secrets that went far beyond the stolen deed. Jane knew she had to act quickly. The trial had stirred the pot, and the thief, whoever they were, would be on edge. She needed to piece together the clues before they could cover their tracks. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her, and spread out her notes on the small writing desk, her eyes falling on the letter she had found in Lady Ashworth's desk. The elegant script was unmistakable, and the contents were damning. "Dear Sir Reginald," the letter began, "I must insist that you cease your inquiries into the Ashworth estate. The matter is settled, and further interference will not be tolerated." Jane read the letter again, her mind racing. Sir Reginald had been investigating the estate's history, and Lady Ashworth had tried to stop him. But why? What was so important about the estate's origins that it warranted such secrecy? She turned her attention to the charred scrap of paper she had found near the safe. The words, "The deed is the key to everything," echoed in her mind. Jane knew she was missing something, a crucial piece of the puzzle that would tie everything together. Confronting Lady Ashworth. Jane decided to confront Lady Ashworth again, this time with the letter in hand. She found the lady of the house in the conservatory, seated on a wrought-iron bench, surrounded by lush greenery. Lady Ashworth looked up as Jane approached, her expression guarded. "Miss Parsons," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What can I do for you?" Jane held up the letter. "I need you to explain this. I do not believe you have told me the entire truth." Lady Ashworth hesitated, then nodded. "There's something I did not tell you before. My husband's grandfather forged the deed. The estate rightfully belongs to another family. If the truth were to come out, we would lose everything." Jane's eyes widened. This was bigger than she had imagined. The stolen deed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the key to a decades-old scandal that could destroy the Ashworth. Jane decided she needed to revisit the guest's motives in light of this new information. Sir Reginald Blythe. The retired judge had been investigating the estate's history, possibly to expose the Ashworth secrets. But was he the thief, or was he trying to prevent the theft? Mr. Charles Whittaker. The industrialist had a grudge against Lord Ashworth and a reputation for shady dealings. Was he trying to seize control of the estate? Miss Evelyn Hart. The young artist had been evasive and nervous. Did she know more than she was letting on? Mrs. Beatrice Crowe. The gossip columnist had been eager to share information, but her motives were unclear. Was she trying to expose the Ashworths, or was she working with someone else? Jane knew she needed more evidence to connect the dots. She decided to search the guests' rooms, starting with Sir Reginald's. She waited until the house was quiet before making her way to Sir Reginald's room. She picked the lock with ease, slipping inside and closing the door softly behind her. The room was neat and orderly, with a large desk near the window. Jane began her search, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. She found a stack of letters in the desk drawer, all related to the Ashworth estate. One letter in particular caught her eye, a draft of a legal document challenging the estate's ownership. "Interesting," Jane murmured to herself. She also found a small notebook filled with notes about the estate's history, including references to the forged deed. Sir Reginald had clearly been digging deep, but there was no evidence linking him to the theft. Next, Jane searched Miss Evelyn Hart's room. The young artist's room was cluttered with half-finished paintings and sketchbooks. Jane flipped through the pages, her eyes falling on a sketch of the study window, complete with the ivy-covered wall. "So you were watching," Jane murmured. She also found a letter tucked inside the sketchbook, addressed to Evelyn from a man named Thomas Hart. The letter mentioned the Ashworth estate and hinted at a family connection. Jane's eyes narrowed. Was Evelyn related to the rightful owners of the estate? As Jane returned to her room, her mind raced with possibilities. The stolen deed was the key to a decades-old scandal, and each guest had a motive for wanting it. But who had taken it? She sat at her desk, spreading out her notes and the clues she had gathered. The ink smudge on the safe, the charred scrap of paper, the letters and sketches. It all pointed to one conclusion. The thief was someone who knew the estate's secrets and had a personal stake in exposing them. But who? Jane's eyes fell on the sketch of the study window. The answer was staring her in the face. The revelation. Jane stood and made her way to Miss Evelyn Hart's room. She knocked softly on the door, and after a moment, Evelyn opened it, her eyes red and puffy as if she had been crying. "Miss Parsons," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what can I do for you?" Jane held up the sketch. "I need you to explain this." Evelyn's face paled, but she quickly recovered. "It's just a sketch. I like to draw." Jane's eyes narrowed. "It's more than that, isn't it? You were watching the study window because you knew someone would try to steal the deed." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I wanted to stop them." Jane studied her for a moment, her mind racing. "Who were you trying to stop?" Evelyn looked away, her voice barely audible. "My father, he's the rightful owner of the estate." Chapter 7. The Double Bluff. The revelation about Evelyn Hart's connection to the Ashworth estate sent Jane's mind into overdrive. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her, and spread out her notes on the small writing desk. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was more complex than she had anticipated. Evelyn's father, Thomas Hart, was the rightful owner of the estate. If the forged deed were exposed, the Ashworths would lose everything. But who had stolen the deed, and why? Jane knew she needed to act quickly. The thief, whoever they were, would be on edge after the mock trial, and time was running out. The hidden connection. Jane began by revisiting the clues she had gathered. The ink smudge on the safe's dial. The charred scrap of paper with Lady Ashworth's handwriting. The sketch of the study window in Evelyn's sketchbook. The letter from Thomas Hart to Evelyn hinting at their connection to the estate. She also considered the guest's motives. Sir Reginald Blythe, the retired judge, had been investigating the estate's history, possibly to expose the Ashworth secrets. Mr. Charles Whittaker. The industrialist had a grudge against Lord Ashworth and a reputation for shady dealings. Mrs. Beatrice Crowe. The gossip columnist had been eager to share information, but her motives were unclear. Evelyn Hart, the young artist, was the daughter of the estate's rightful owner, giving her a personal stake in the matter. Jane tried to connect the dots. The stolen deed was the key to a decades-old scandal, and each guest had a motive for wanting it. But who had taken it? Jane decided to confront Evelyn again, this time with the letter from her father in hand. She found the young artist in the conservatory, seated on a wrought-iron bench surrounded by lush greenery. Evelyn looked up as Jane approached, her expression guarded. "Miss Parsons," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "what can I do for you?" Jane held up the letter. "I need you to explain this." Evelyn's face paled, but she quickly recovered. "Where did you find that?" "In your sketchbook," Jane replied, her tone neutral. "Care to explain?" Evelyn hesitated, then sighed. "Very well. I suppose there's no point in hiding it any longer. My father, he's the rightful owner of the estate. My grandfather was cheated out of it by Lord Ashworth's grandfather. If the truth were to come out, we could reclaim what's rightfully ours." Jane's eyes narrowed. "And you think someone stole the deed to help you?" Evelyn shook her head. "Number I wanted to stop them. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Jane studied her for a moment, her mind racing. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. There's more. My father has been working with someone to expose the Ashworths' secrets. I don't know who, but they're dangerous." Jane's eyes widened. This was bigger than she had imagined. The stolen deed wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the key to a decades-old scandal that could destroy the Ashworths and put Evelyn's family in danger. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The revelation that Evelyn Hart's father, Thomas Hart, was the rightful owner of the Ashworth estate sent Jane Parsons' mind into overdrive. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her, and spread out her notes on the small writing desk. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was more complex than she had anticipated. Jane knew she needed to act quickly. The thief, whoever they were, would be on edge after the mock trial, and time was running out. She decided to confront the guests one by one, starting with Sir Reginald Blythe, confronting Sir Reginald Blythe. Jane found Sir Reginald in the library, seated in his usual chair with a book in hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Miss Parsons," he said, closing the book with a snap. "What can I do for you now?" Jane held up the draft of the legal document she had found in his room. "I need you to explain this." Sir Reginald's face paled, but he quickly recovered. "Where did you find that?" "In your room," Jane replied, her tone neutral. "Care to explain?" Sir Reginald sighed, setting the book aside. "Very well. I've been investigating the Ashworth estate for some time. There are irregularities in its history that I believe need to be addressed." "Irregularities?" Jane repeated, her eyes narrowing. Sir Reginald nodded. "The estate was acquired under questionable circumstances. I've been trying to uncover the truth, but Lady Ashworth has been less than cooperative." Jane studied him for a moment, her mind racing. "And you think the theft of the deed is connected to your investigation?" Sir Reginald hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible. Whoever stole the deed may be trying to protect the Ashworth secrets, or expose them." Jane made a note of this, but said nothing. She thanked Sir Reginald and left the library, her mind turning over the new information. Confronting Mr. Charles Whittaker. Next, Jane sought out Mr. Charles Whittaker, who was lounging in the billiards room with a glass of brandy in hand. He looked up as she entered, his smirk firmly in place. "Miss Parsons," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast, "what can I do for you?" Jane held up the letter she had found in his room. "I need you to explain this." Whittaker's smirk faded slightly. "Where did you find that?" "In your room," Jane replied, her tone neutral. "Care to explain?" Whittaker sighed, setting his glass aside. "Very well, I've been in contact with Thomas Hart. He's the rightful owner of the estate, and he's been trying to reclaim it for years. I agreed to help him in exchange for a share of the profits." Jane's eyes narrowed. "And you think stealing the deed will help you achieve that?" Whittaker shrugged. "It's a means to an end. The Ashworths have held on to that estate for far too long. It's time for a change." Jane studied him for a moment, her mind racing. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" Whittaker hesitated, then nodded. There's more. Thomas Hart has been working with someone to expose the Ashworth secrets. I don't know who, but they're dangerous." Next, Jane decided to confront Mrs. Beatrice Crowe. She found her in the drawing room, her notebook open in front of her, as she scribbled furiously. The gossip columnist looked up as Jane approached, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Miss Parsons," she said, setting down her pen, "what can I do for you?" Jane held up the letter she had found in her room. "I need you to explain this." Mrs. Crowe's face paled, but she quickly recovered. "Where did you find that?" "In your room," Jane replied, her tone neutral. "Care to explain?" Mrs. Crowe hesitated, then sighed. Very well. I've been in contact with Thomas Hart. He's the rightful owner of the estate, and he's been trying to reclaim it for years. This is juicy gossip for my column, you know." Jane studied her for a moment, her mind racing. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" Mrs. Crowe hesitated, then nodded. There's more. Thomas Hart has been working with someone to expose the Ashworth secrets. I don't know who, but they're dangerous." Jane's eyes widened. This was bigger than she had imagined. The stolen deed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the key to a decades-old scandal. Chapter 9, The Resolution. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke, rain lashing against the windows of Ashworth Manor as Jane Parsons stood in the grand hall. The revelations from her confrontations with the guests had painted a complex picture of deceit, betrayal, and long-buried secrets. The stolen deed to the Ashworth estate was more than just a piece of paper. It was the key to a decades-old scandal that could destroy the family and upend the lives of everyone involved. Jane knew she had to act quickly. The thief, whoever they were, would be desperate to cover their tracks, and time was running out. She gathered her notes and made her way to the study where Lord and Lady Ashworth were waiting. Lord Ashworth looked up as Jane entered, his expression a mix of hope and desperation. "Miss Parsons," he said, his voice tight, "have you found the deed?" Jane shook her head. "Not yet, but I've uncovered some troubling information." She laid out her findings on the desk, including the charred scrap of paper, the draft of the legal document from Sir Reginald's room, and the letter from Thomas Hart to Evelyn. Lady Ashworth's face paled as she recognised her own handwriting on the scrap of paper. "What is this?" Lord Ashworth demanded, his voice rising. Jane took a deep breath. "The estate. It doesn't belong to you? Not really. Your grandfather acquired it through forged documents, and the rightful owner is Thomas Hart, Evelyn's father." Lord Ashworth sank into a chair, his face ashen. I had no idea." Lady Ashworth looked away, her hands trembling. "I tried to protect us," she whispered. "I thought if we could keep the deed hidden, no one would ever know." Jane's eyes narrowed. But someone did know, and they stole the deed to expose the truth. She walked with them from the study to the drawing room, where she had requested all the guests gather. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jane began, her voice calm but firm, "I've uncovered the truth about the stolen deed. The Ashworth estate was acquired through forged documents, and the rightful owner is Thomas Hart, Evelyn's father." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Evelyn looked down, her face pale, while Sir Reginald and Mr. Whittaker exchanged uneasy glances. "But that's not all," Jane continued. "The thief is someone who knew the estate's secrets and had a personal stake in exposing them." She turned to Mrs. Beatrice Crowe, who was seated near the fireplace, her notebook in hand. "Mrs. Crowe, would you care to explain?" The gossip columnist looked up, her expression one of feigned innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Parsons." Jane held up the letter she had found in Mrs. Crowe's room. "This letter proves that you've been in contact with Thomas Hart. You agreed to help him expose the Ashworths' secrets in exchange for exclusive rights to the story." Mrs. Crowe's face flushed with anger. "That's a lie." Jane shook her head. "It's the truth. You stole the deed to force the Ashworths into a corner, knowing they would do anything to keep their secret hidden." Mrs. Crowe stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You have no proof." Jane reached into her pocket and pulled out the charred scrap of paper. "This was found near the safe. It's in Lady Ashworth's handwriting, but it was burned to hide the evidence. You took it to use as leverage, didn't you?" Mrs. Crowe's defiance faltered, and she sank back into her chair, her face pale. The room fell silent as Mrs. Crow finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Yes, I took the deed. I wanted to expose the Ashworths' secrets. They've held on to that estate for far too long, and it's time for the truth to come out." Lord Ashworth stood, his face a mask of fury. "How dare you? This estate is my family's legacy." "A legacy built on lies," Mrs. Crow shot back, her voice sharp. "Your grandfather stole this estate from Thomas Hart, and it's time for justice to be served." Jane stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "The deed will be returned to its rightful owner, and the Ashworths will face the consequences of their actions. But this isn't just about the estate. It's about the lives that have been affected by this decades-old scandal." The aftermath. The police were called, and Mrs. Crow was taken into custody. The stolen deed was recovered from her room, hidden in a false bottom of her suitcase. Lord and Lady Ashworth were left to grapple with the fallout of their family secrets, while Evelyn Hart prepared to reunite with her father and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Epilogue: A New Beginning. Back in her London office, Jane sat at her desk, a cup of tea in hand. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to peek through the clouds. She opened a letter that had arrived that morning, her eyes scanning the contents. "Dear Miss Parsons," the letter began, "thank you for uncovering the truth about the Ashworth estate. My father and I are forever grateful for your help. We look forward to starting a new chapter in our lives, and we hope you will visit us soon. Sincerely, Evelyn Hart." Jane smiled, setting the letter aside. The mystery of Ashworth Manor was behind her, but she knew there would always be more cases to solve, more secrets to uncover. As she sipped her tea, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction.